Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join in. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to today's King's Expert Series webinar on universities and Black Lives Matter. This webinar is part of our online event series for our global alumni community. Each month, you'll have the opportunity to tune in and hear from some of our leading academics, researchers, and practitioners on some of the most important and relevant issues of our time. If you missed any of our recent webinars, you can catch up anytime on the King's Alumni YouTube channel. Today, you'll be hearing from our panelists as they share their thoughts on the position of higher education in light of recent events and the Black Lives Matter movement. We've already shared their bios, but I will briefly introduce our speakers. So we have Sarah Guerra, who is the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at King's, and spearheads the college's strategic vision and implementation plans across these areas for the whole King's community. We have Dr. Liburd, who is a lecturer in colonial and postcolonial British history at King's. Joining our history department this year, Liam's research interests lie in the history, impact and legacy of empire, decolonisation and race in 20th century Britain. Our chair for today's webinar is Professor Funmi Olonisakin. Funmi is Vice President and Vice Principal International at King's. She is also a Professor of Security, Leadership and Development and the Founding Director of the African Leadership Centre at King's. Just a few quick notes about the format of the discussion before I hand over to our chair. Following introductions from our panel, we'll then turn to your questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Do keep in mind that since we have so many of you in the audience today, we may not be able to get to every single question. Another way to participate is by clicking the like button next to the question you'd like to hear answered. As with every edition of the King's Expert Series, we tackle some of society's biggest issues, so naturally there is a strength of feeling around all of our topics. Tonight is no different, but we would like to reiterate that we'll only be taking reasoned, developed questions for our panel, and we can only facilitate this if you're on the Zoom platform. Unfortunately, no questions can be taken on any of our other channels. You are also welcome to continue the debate on all of our topics throughout the series on LinkedIn. Just be sure to use the hashtag King's Expert Series. I'll now hand over to our chair of today's panel, Professor Funmi Olonisakin.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this. A few opening remarks from me, and I think we have watched this year roll by in very interesting ways. It's safe to say, I think, that the world changed profoundly earlier in 2020. We saw the outbreak of COVID-19, which at the time, experts said, this was an unknown and an unprecedented virus. Hot on the heels of the outbreak of COVID-19, we began to witness a series of events. But I think we now know that the events surrounding the deaths of Breonna Taylor, the killing of George Floyd, and the shooting of Jacob Blake have shaken the whole world in profound ways and triggered a series or a wave of activism globally. We've had a cross-section of people, artists and athletes protesting against systemic racism. We've seen statues that were tied to countries' colonial past, which have been toppled in various places, removed by some institutions, generating quite a bit of controversy in several cases. Now, what we now know is the profoundness of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is forcing all of us to deeply challenge our societies, our institutions in very profound ways. The higher education institution, including our universities, are no exceptions. We have already seen through earlier reports and earlier papers. In the past couple of years, we have seen a variety of discourses that have really talked about the under-acknowledged role of the university in terms of how it has dealt with racism or not dealt with racism. I think more significantly, we saw the report, for example, of the Equality and Human Rights Commission titled Tackling Racial Harassment, Universities Challenged. That report that came out in October last year, 2019, already signaled what is to come, but nobody knew at the time. We couldn't possibly have known that COVID-19 and the events surrounding the killing of George Floyd, for example, will begin to change our discourse and our action profoundly. And tonight, I think it's important to begin to to shed light on what this means in the university space. As Vice Principal International, I think I'm delighted to say that it was as though we knew what was to come, because we spent much of the last 3 years actually preparing our university for a new way of thinking about internationalization. And deeply embedded within that was the whole notion of decolonizing the curriculum. That's why it's very clear that we're a few steps ahead of the game. Vision 2029 itself gave us all the parameters of what internationalization, London, education and research and service, which is at the core, service to society, which is at the core of that vision, gave us the parameters to really redefine them in radical ways, very unlike what we might have been thinking about, say, 10, 15 years ago. And I think that today, I am proud to say that King's is one of the leaders of the pack. When you look across the Russell Group of universities, for example, on the kinds of meaningful things that we're doing to transform, to change the culture of our university. We're nowhere near where we want to be, but this discourse is alive, and we will be compelled to enter a brand new world, I think, in the next period. I think this is like no other moment in history. And in that regard, I'm delighted that we have Sarah Guerra and we have Liam here with us today. We're really proud to have Liam Liburd with us at King's. Over to you. I'll start with Sarah to give us your own introductory remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Funmi. Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Guerra. I'm the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion here at King's College London. I'm also the daughter of immigrants, someone born in Tottenham, someone who changed primary schools 3 times, who went to a mediocre secondary school and university. And I'm the first person in my family to go to university. All the way through, I was discouraged by those in authority from having any real ambition, discouraged and told people like me, don't do A-levels, or degrees, or the law, or join the civil service. And in fact, here I find myself working at a globally renowned, extremely prestigious and well-respected elite university at a senior level in a job that I love and an expert in my field, where I help shape and guide our leaders, our managers and our students and the future direction of the university. And the sad thing is we all know that with my profile, that was not a likely outcome. And that still isn't likely today. So I'm really excited to be here at this webinar, Universities and Black Lives Matter. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my role at King's, a little bit about what EDI is, and how I see us needing to behave in the future to maximise this, how Funmi just described it, the opportunities given to us at the moment to change the future, so that we're not living this same cycle over and over again. So my role at King's as the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion gives me the opportunity to lead the college's strategic vision and implementation plans for the whole campus community. So that includes staff and students. Often organisations, or in the past, we would separate all these communities and we wouldn't look at it in a holistic way. I was appointed in 2017, and since then I've instigated a suite of strategic projects where I'm trying to revolutionise our attitudes and approach and the impact of the equality, diversity and inclusion work that we do. I particularly champion the use of data to build an evidence base for all activity. And today our conversation is going to look specifically at race, racism and Black Lives Matters. And these are critical subjects. And it's very important in my view to think about them in the overall context of society and our university. And when talking about them, it's really important to think about them intersectionally. Nobody is a single thing. We need to recognise that racism is something systemic, and we can only tackle it by really examining our systems, processes, practices and behaviours, which is what, if you look at our EDI strategy, that's what it aims to do. Critically, it's not all negative. It's not all about stopping people. EDI, in my view, is a real innovation mechanism. It enables creativity and the release of talent. And what I'll talk a little bit about in a second is how to leverage that. We really need to think about how we disrupt the norm to make change. And on that note, we can just think about that in the last few months. What's happened, King's own reaction to COVID and how much enormous and unimaginable change wouldn't have seemed possible if we talked about it this time last year. Similarly, the global response to those really horrendous events in America in the last few years, they're not a surprise, I don't think. However, the change in the dynamic and the conversation is. So what is equality, diversity and inclusion? It's how we ensure that people are seen and heard for their knowledge, their talent and their capabilities, and that things like the colour of their skin, their gender, their age, their sexual orientation, whether or not they have a disability, are not relevant factors to whether or not they are talented and capable of doing the job or studying at this university or wherever they choose. And it's about how we deconstruct existing mindsets and beliefs and how we create the conditions so that all individuals take the time and effort needed not to fall into default assumptions. And as I've said, it's really critical that we do that intersectionally, that we do not look at gender in one conversation and race in another conversation, sexual orientation in another, that we recognise we are human beings with multifaceted identities, but the nature of those identities each create different opportunities and different disadvantages. Diversity and inclusion is not just something that's nice, it's not just something that's moral. There is a real business case behind it. There is a lot of research that shows productivity is increased and the innovation and well-being are all improved where you have an inclusive workplace or environment, and that all leads to competitive advantage. So equality, diversity and inclusion must form all parts of all of our decision-making processes, and that's what we're striving for here at King's, so that we can understand each other and think about, got my notes mixed up, so that we can ensure that everyone can be creative and thoughtful. We have to recognise we're in a higher education context, that brings in the external societal and identity factors, and I'm sure that will come up in the Q&A today, that all the characteristics I've described all layer into our institution, but also that we have other intersections. We have students and we have staff. Within staff, we have academic staff, research staff, professional staff. All of those create complications, and our thinking and our actions in relation to those needs to be able to be sophisticated and broad enough to take account of these layers and interactions. And that requires us to have an innovative mindset. I don't have time to go into that in detail today. Maybe we'll pick it up in the questions, but I did a lecture on it as part of our AKC series last year. And I'd recommend you sort of listen to that to think more about how we develop mindsets and types of thinking, how we enable ourselves to reflect beyond the actions taken and look instead at the reasons why they've been taken. Because without that, we won't be able to see and uncover systemic disadvantage. And critically, we must hear from those who've experienced those impacts and be able to expose them. So, in summary, tackling racism requires disruption on an individual and organisational level. The status quo is powerful, and that is why, despite things like the Race Relations Act being passed decades ago, we still find ourselves with many issues persisting. So I'm really excited for our discussion, and I'll hand over to Liam.
Thank you, Sarah. I suppose I'll begin where Sarah left off, because I think, so I'm a historian, and the history of this I think is incredibly relevant when it comes to the present of universities and problems with racism and diversity. I mean, I think something that at the moment I'm in the process of designing a module to run at King's next semester for second year students, which is sort of getting students to explore King's colonial past. So the elements of King's history as an institution that intersect with the history of empire in Britain. And something that struck me as I've been doing the sort of preliminary research for that is that, you know, the first time that British universities like King's interacted with people of colour, they did so either in the form of slaves, so the proceeds from the slave trade went into funding a lot of universities, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later, or they interacted with them as colonial subjects, you know, so as they were training the civil servants who would go out to administer the various different colonies that were part of the British Empire, and they were training various other sort of professional, you know, colonial administrators and other things. And I'll talk a bit more about that later as well. So I think, you know, you've got to foreground this conversation about the sort of the present and the sort of contemporary events with this historical context. You know, just this afternoon, actually, I've been in the archives at King's looking at the donor registers for King's in the year it was founded in 1828. And 10% of the original subscribers who gave money to found King's were slave owners. You know, and they were giving contributions of, in old money, £100, £300, which sort of in modern day currencies is not an insignificant amount. And I think it's important to sort of keep that in mind when we're talking about this discussion. And it's not that King's is necessarily, you know, alone in that. I mean, the University of Glasgow, it was recently found, has profited from the Atlantic slave trade to the tune of almost £200 million in modern currency. You know, the University of Cambridge, of Oxford, of Nottingham and Liverpool are all at the moment carrying out research projects to try and work out the scale of their involvement in the Atlantic slave trade as well. But so to move on to sort of the picture specifically in the discipline of history at the minute. I mean, we know that you know, higher education, both generally and in specific terms of history, has a diversity problem. You know, the Royal Historical Society carried out the race, ethnicity and equality report in 2018 and found that history and the philosophical studies, which is a sort of broad category for a number of different arts humanities subjects, was essentially an overwhelmingly white course in terms of both actually of the nature of the curriculum and the demographic mix of students, markedly more so than other disciplines, both in the arts and in you know, sciences and other topics, in other subject areas. And I mean, they found a number of things. There's also another report by the Universities UK, which was a more general report about the ethnicity attainment gap. So the fact that BME students were not doing as well, and often sometimes dropping out of their courses before they completed it. And they found that there are a number of sort of factors contributing to those things. I mean, I think some of them sort of chime with my personal experience of higher education. So one was institutional culture. So essentially, you know, partly that's the willingness of the institution to have those conversations and to sort of be open to that disruption that Sarah talked about just a moment ago. But also part of it is the degree to which the people in that institution feel comfortable having those conversations and even sort of understand the terms of the discussion. Another factor was the low numbers of BME staff. Now this has sort of two effects. On the one hand, you have the fact that there are no role models or few role models for existing students to sort of, you know, aspire to and you know, look up to. And then you have the fact that, you know, you have a small burden, you have a huge burden on a small number of staff when it comes to diversity initiatives. So they end up falling to these sort of a small number of already very busy BME staff members. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier as well, the curriculum. So the idea that, you know, the curriculum focuses on a Eurocentric, white, primarily European selection of subjects is another thing that turns students off, BME students off of history. And I mean, both at King's and other universities are trying to make sort of an effort to decolonize the curriculum, which again, I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of my talk as well. I mean, another thing is that, and I think this links again to the point that Sarah was making about intersectionality, which I think is important, not just in terms of race, in terms of sexuality and sexual identity, but also in terms of class. And you know, the whether students, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of income, it's whether students have someone at home who understands the university system. I mean, I still remember going to the first open days I went to with my parents, who neither of whom had gone to university, neither of whom had any idea about the system. And I think they felt very confused as to what kind of advice and information to give me. You know, it was very difficult. I think that's the case for students, both BME and otherwise. And I think for BME students, it's a sort of double burden. I think, and again, to sort of re-emphasize, I think the lack of role models is a massive part of this. And I think, you know, that's partly the reason why there's such a diversity problem. And I think the other thing that the report underlined is that a lot of these inequalities don't necessarily start at university level. They start at A level and they start at GCSE, sort of in the British context at least anyway. And I suppose some ways we might address the situation is to address those problems I've just outlined. You know, encourage the hiring of more BME staff. You know, decolonize your curriculums, and I suppose I better sort of unpack what that term means. I keep using it. I mean, in terms of history, I think my discipline is the definition that I favour, though it's sort of, as a term, has lots of different meanings. Some academic, some political. I mean, it's all political, but yeah, I mean, I think it's taken on a life of its own. But the definition that I favour comes from an edited collection written by a number of academics in 2018, and they defined decolonizing as a way of thinking about the world which takes colonialism, empire, and racism as its empirical and discursive objects of study, resituating these phenomena as key shaping forces of the contemporary world in a context where their role has been systematically effaced from view. And that's sort of very much the approach I try to take both in my research and my teaching. And I think, as I say, the efforts are sort of afoot to try and deal with that problem, but we'll see how they go, I suppose. I mean, I think the reason I think that is important as well, decolonizing, is not just simply for the self-esteem of BME students, though that is obviously part of it. I think it's also important to sort of focus on my discipline for a minute, because it produces better history. You know, you can't really if your history doesn't take into account, say, the history of Africa, the sort of the African experience of slavery or the resistance to slavery, that's not a full history of slavery. If it's not, if you don't take in the, if you're doing a course on the fall of the British Empire, if you're not also taking in maybe bits of the history of Ghana, bits of the history of South Africa, you're not getting a full picture of British history, of that topic. Similarly with British history, if you're not looking at the history, the long history that goes back, as Peter Fryer found in the 1980s, right back to ancient Britain, of Black people in Britain, then you're not telling the full story of Britain. So I think it's about doing better history, as well as the sort of the social justice aims of it as well. And I suppose just to return to the final, to the point I made earlier about the burden on the few sort of BME staff that we have, it's difficult sorting these problems because it inevitably falls to existing staff to take on a sort of activist role and to push for these things voluntarily. And to use their own time, which is also work time. Everyone's very busy. I think there's no better way to highlight that, I think, than the fact that I only started at King's 2 months ago, and this is my third Black History Month event that I've done. And it does raise the question, and I've enjoyed doing every one of them. I'm absolutely delighted to be asked, but it does raise the question: where are the senior Black academics in history? This role is. I only handed in my PhD less than a year ago. I only passed my Viva exam in March. Where are the senior Black academics in history that should be doing this? Should be having, should be leading these conversations? Because David Olashoga can't do it all. So that's my piece. Thank you very much. Funmi, you're muted, sorry.
Yes, I just realized that. Thank you so much, Liam, and Sarah. Thank you so much for your presentations. I think you have each raised, you've pointed to significant issues, but the point on which you closed, Liam, is really also at the core of the questions that many of our students have asked us for a while. Where are the Black, leading academics, Black leaders administratively, and so on at King's? And I think that is profound because it speaks to some of the structural issues that you've been talking about. But I think we can now get into some really good discussion. We've had some questions come in, and maybe we can use these questions as a basis to begin to tease out some of those issues in greater detail. So here's one. As a British, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male, should I feel guilty about or ashamed of my country's past colonial history? And we could tie this to another question, and that was from John. That was John's question. Francis says this: in this country, can we not get back to color doesn't matter? It's what you are that matters. So that logic is very clear to us that we can get back to that. Can we just try to tease out those two interrelated questions? Should one feel guilty about or ashamed of my country's past colonial history? Is that the key thing we should be looking at? Or can we not get back to the idea that color doesn't matter and that it's what you are that matters? Eminently sensible, but
Sarah, did you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
So I think for John's question about whether you should feel shame or guilt, I don't believe anyone should feel shame or guilt for the things that they had no control over. I think it's about understanding that past and being clear about the things we are proud about and the things we celebrate. And as Liam said in his section, that I as a British, someone who grew up here, learned history at school, learned certain parts of history. History is always about whoever survives to tell the tale and whoever is in charge of the narrative. And I think in 2020, it's about that we all have a responsibility to broaden that narrative, and that's the responsibility. It's not about shame or guilt, I would say. And I suppose in response to Francis's, in this country, can we not get back to colour doesn't matter? I think the reality is colour has always mattered. It just wasn't obvious that it mattered. When my mum and dad came to this country, they believed they were British citizens here, welcome. They also met, it always sounds trite, but they met signs that said no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. They had landlords who threw their stuff out because once they realised who they were, they didn't want them to live there. So colour has always mattered, either overtly or covertly. And what I think we need to get to is a recognition that prejudice exists and bias exists in lots of different ways, and that we need to consciously overcome it. And then, absolutely, we see people for who they are and what they contribute, not what they look like.
Thank you, Sarah.
I think I'll take John's question first. I mean, I wrote, so when I was preparing notes for this, we had that question sent ahead, and I wrote no initially, and then I wrote, or perhaps yes, but it depends, I think, on whether the guilt is productive or not. So, if John does feel guilty, I hope that he channels that guilt into something positive and productive. To ensure that racism is confined to the past. But if it's, I don't want it to be, if it's an unproductive guilt, then that's no use. I think that's for me the place of guilt in this conversation. The other question, I mean, I'm a little suspicious as a historian of what period the questioner wants to go back to before those things mattered. I mean, I think, to get sort of philosophical for a moment, for me, anti-racism is a form of humanism, in the sense that it's not about colour necessarily, it's about humanity. The slogan Black Lives Matter, which is in the title of the event today, is in some senses, an abbreviation. I mean, what it means is Black lives matter as much as any other human life. It's not about prizing your skin color so much as it is about sort of shared and essential humanity. That's sort of how I see it, not as an attempt to sort of put everyone into different colored boxes. In fact, that's very much the opposite, as I understood it anyway.
Great. No, thank you. Because really, this is a question of difference as well. So race and race history, when you talk about slavery and you talk about colonialism, it does something. It has some deep, deep connotations even today. But if we're talking about whether color matters in that sense, well, it's a conversation about difference as well, isn't it? Because there's a lot of difference in society today. And if we ignore the fact that there's difference and that people are treated unfairly on the basis of that difference, whether it's race or something else, or gender or religion, whatever it is, then it really still doesn't solve the problem. I think that's a very important question to really reflect on. But just moving on to some of the questions that had been sent to us. Colin says, how can we be anywhere near where we want to be, considering the inequalities of wealth in the UK? Talking about difference, whether we're talking about race or not, the question of inequalities of wealth is one that confronts every single society. But his point is, even if we wanted to really get over all of this and radically transform and be in a new place, what does this mean if we have this kind of inequalities of wealth in the country? you want to try to respond to that?
Do you want to go first, Liam, this time? Or?
Okay. I mean, I spoke a little bit about class in my my introduction earlier, and I think that conversation underlines the whole discussion of inequalities at university. I think class. I mean, that's something that runs throughout the other sort of categories of inequality, and makes them all more complex and more difficult to solve. I don't know. I mean, I suppose we can only do what we can. I mean, I suppose we know we're doing what we do, knowing that we're sort of working against, huge bureaucratic institutions that, as bureaucracies always are inured to change, right? And we're doing that in the context of a hideously unequal society in terms of wealth as well. I mean, I suppose we are but little pieces within an institution trying to sort of do something good. I mean, I suppose it's a good question, but I thinking about it makes me feel less optimistic.
Right. No, thank you. This question is quite different from the others, because I think Matthew is already thinking about his own context where he might be able to do something. My company has just formed a diversity and inclusion team. We recruit scientists post-PhD, and often by then there's already less diversity. I wondered what might be suggested as good first steps that we can take to help raise the diversity of those we eventually recruit. Very, very, very good question, I think.
Sarah, take this one, I think.
Okay, all right.
So, I mean, I suppose the first thing I'll say, Matthew, is if you want to drop me a line and have a discussion, we can only have a limited discussion today, but this is my bread and butter. This is the question we wrestle with in so many contexts. And some basic things are building self-awareness within your organisation. So conversations like this that help people to understand what diversity is, why it's important, why it will make your company better. Being clear, your leadership team are really in support. So that equality, diversity and inclusion team being very connected to the leadership team. And then thinking about and getting data, understanding who you currently recruit, what those different populations look like. Are people applying to you and you're not recruiting them, or are you not receiving their applications? And then you can do more things to make yourself attractive. I take your point that your pipeline might be narrower. However, that just means you have to work a bit harder and maybe think about what you do to connect with universities who have particularly high BME, undergraduates and postgraduates, to encourage them to go into the sorts of careers that you're offering. Think about internships that are dedicated to the particular underrepresented groups you're looking for. I mean, I could go on and on and on. We're about to publish our annual report and we have our EDI strategy. What I would suggest is you have a look at those, and you need to scale those to the kind of place that you are. I'm very happy to have a sort of offline conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Liam, I don't know whether you have anything to say to that, but I feel very challenged by Matthew's question, because what does this say when a Russell Group university, or when Russell Group universities don't have nearly enough BME recruits, or BME PhD scholars that are able to do work post-PhD. And I think it says a lot, therefore, about our own recruitment patterns when it comes to doctoral candidates. It says a lot about the pipelines that we create, because ultimately, I don't know what, I don't know the name of Matthew's companies, but most companies behave the same way. They want to recruit from the top institutions, that assumptions have been made that the best of the best will come to our institutions. That's what we know at King's, that's what we say. So we are, I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't got any sort of concrete advice. I mean, I think and it links to what you just said there, Funmi. I think sometimes, companies have a sort of like, they have an idea of a person who would fit in the company culture, and it's not necessarily about the potential or skills of the person who's not that isn't also part of it. But I think if someone is maybe looks a different way or is a different way, than the candidates you usually hire, but it's no less skilled. So I'm guessing I'm saying keep an open mind, and keep your eyes out for the raw potential rather than for the sort of ideal candidate as a profile, I suppose.
No, indeed. No, and that's something to really reflect on. So Matthew, please follow up with Sarah so that at least she can advise, offer immediate advice. But I think there's also something for us, for Kings, to continue to think about, and we have been doing this in recent times. Sarah, Siobhan has a question directly for you. Sarah mentioned the necessity for data to drive change. She also mentioned the necessity for viewing people in an intersectional way. I agree totally. How do you gather intersectional data? This is something we've been talking about at King's at the moment. Sarah?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think it sort of depends on the level of resources you have. At King's, we have put a lot of effort into it. We've invested in a business analytics team. We have invested in a variety of systems and tools. So we recently rolled out a HR digital service so that every single person who works here can input their equal opportunities information. We worked as a team to make sure that set of questions that people are being asked are quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Varied and robust. So that gives us the data input that we can then pull out and create. We use Power BI dashboards to enable us to look at that data through a variety of different lenses and intersections. It depends on your size, but I think the first starting point is always deciding to do it, recognizing that you do need data and thinking about what's practical and thinking about it in as sophisticated a way as whoever you are is capable of at that time. And there's loads of advice out there, depending on what sector you're in. There is loads of, the Advanced HE has stuff for the higher education sector. If you're in government, there's loads of advice. Small businesses, there's things like Race for Opportunity. So there are lots of different partners or places that can help you think through without it costing you a lot of money. What can we sensibly collect now, and what do we build to over time? There's something about we use this phrase and I don't really like it, but boil the ocean. There is something about taking steps in an intentional way over time, recognizing where you're trying to get to.
Thank you, Sarah. But can I just maybe ask a related question, just to expand this issue? This is the thing. At King's, at this moment, we've been having this conversation, and you've been planning the entire EDI strategy, and you said that earlier, and I know that, on the basis of intersectionality. That's the approach you're taking. How can we make change? I've seen loads of questions coming in now, and we will take we'll deal with as many of them as we can. But how can we concretely move in the direction we want to move when we have an external frame, whether it's government or other organizations, but certainly governmental institutions that look at all these issues separately? They look at gender separately, and so we will do Athena Swan today, we will do Stonewall tomorrow, we'll do Race Equality Charter Mark the day after, and that itself is a hindrance for an institution that is thinking progressively and wanting to think, we gather this data intersectionally, and I think there are questions we place on this every now and again to move us in the right direction, but if we have to do different kinds of reporting, that slows us down. But do you want to comment on that?
I do. It's going to sound a bit self-serving. You recognise that. So my answer is you recognise that equality, diversity and inclusion is a skill and level of expertise that you need in your business or company or university, and then you invest in that. So people in my team can draw together that information. They can see beyond those walls and understand the connections and help the rest of the university do that. If you don't have that level of expertise, then it is difficult. I think it's difficult for those who are busy or have other expertises to recognise it. And I think there's also, drawing Liam in, there's something, for us, particularly at King's, we are an institution that produces research. That's the thing that we do, and we help others learn. So it's about drawing on all the learning that we have in our community and helping to it. So I had the pleasure of reading Liam's thesis a couple of weeks ago, understanding the connections between things in history is critical. So I think that's, we have to work in the world that we're in, but connect what we're doing to what we're trying to achieve as an institution.
Thank you. Thanks. Liam, did you want to add something to that, or shall I?
I mean, I suppose that the other thing I think is that if we accept that, I mean, I suppose it doesn't matter whether we accept it or not, this is the reality now, I suppose. We accept that students are now customers rather than students, or they're also customers as well as students, in the sense that they are, paying for a service, paying quite a lot of money now for a service. I think one way to affect change is to, is to enlist them. I mean, like the government and sort of management at a sort of inter-institutional level won't necessarily listen to individuals within those institutions. But when it comes down to business interests, and if we make diversity and anti-racism a business interest, and that's why I think it's important what Sarah is saying about there's a business case for this, emphasising that. I mean, it's not a very sexy way of or particularly radical sounding way of fighting for diversity and against racism, but I think it may well be an effective one.
Okay, so a measure of pragmatism, because I believe so much in visioning and values, that actually if our core values are about fairness and justice, it shouldn't matter, whether you're Black, working class, whether you're gendered in different ways. We should treat everyone with fairness. But if that doesn't work, something will force us to do it. And your point is, and actually, to be quite honest, we're having all this conversation today, and we have actually progressed today more than at any other time on this question of, justice for, equality for Black people, because young people, our students everywhere in the world, allied and aligned their views on this issue, regardless of their race, regardless of their class. And I think that's why we're still able to move this issue forward. And in that sense, the next set of questions that I'll take together, beginning to...
So can I just say, so just a final point on that thing, I think there's also something about 52% of King's undergraduate population, or 56%, I forget the exact figure, BME. So if we are not creating a university and helping society create equal outcomes, we are bringing those students in and not delivering on our promise of a good education, because we're essentially not giving them the outcomes that they believe they're going to get to come to King's. So I think there's to be really critical about understanding how much our population, this is not a minority issue. We're not talking about a few people. We're talking about the majority of our undergraduate students.
Absolutely, that's spot on. I think the realities of of these times are beginning to compel us, universities as a whole, especially those that have not been thinking about this issue, or even if they thought about it, didn't see any urgency to it. I think that urgency is very, very clear, because within our communities, our university communities are changing profoundly. So, Zoe is asking, what do you think the role of universities right now needs to be in the larger societal discussion on racism as an institution that is, of course, situated within that society? Absolutely. I think we've moved to the right. And related to that is Elizabeth's question. Is KCL doing any work in British primary and high schools to inform students and raise awareness about BME issues and past history, e.g. colonial history? This is very important. Of course, we do some work in, that is targeted towards high school students. It's not exactly always been like this, but we can talk about it. And to try to frame that, these two questions, which I think really are, they've hit the nail on the head, as it were, is that the university has a social contract with society. And if we are seeing such inequalities in society, and we're not champions of, bringing, ensuring that society is just and fair, because we train and teach members of that society, and we have them in our community, then actually I think we are failing as universities if we do not deal with that fundamentally. And that goes directly to the point of the majority of our undergraduate students are BME students. But I also know that King's has a history in which just under 20 years ago, we committed to the extended medical program, where we said our inner cities have all, students who could thrive, but could never have had a fighting chance to come to King's. We said we'll receive them. It meant that, a reduction in tariffs, but we said we will bring them in. Is medical degrees, instead of 5 years, they would be here for 6 years. We will prepare them. So in a sense, we committed to serving that society a long time ago. But something therefore is wrong if we're not able to, if they come into our campuses, but they do not have a sense of belonging, which, if we're frank, we're speaking to a King's community here, this is a part of the problem. We're not alone in it, but these are the sorts of things that we have been grappling with. And I think really the work we've been doing the past few years, including the momentum now, really means that we need to deal with those issues directly. But the point about the primary schools and high schools goes to your point earlier, Liam, that if we have an education system that does not provide students the true history of the country, that has engaged in different ways globally, does not even help so a part of its community recognize that they have a place in this society and not to be more visible than they have been, that structural damage therefore is done long before they get into the university space. Both within societies and the schools and the education system that has been of disservice to them. And therefore there's complexity to this. But can the university do something about this? Can we do it alone? What do you think? Or can we start?
I mean, you're lucky enough to have one of the school's outreach people from the History Department's Departmental Committee in the call today. So I've only just started in the position. So because of COVID, we haven't done anything with schools this year so far. Yeah. But last year, before I arrived, I understand that we ran with a group of, I think, local secondary school students, a project on Trafalgar Square as a sort of, its own sort of mini architectural history of imperialism, right? So you've got, Nelson in the middle, but around Trafalgar Square, you've got, South Africa House, Canada House, all the sort of big diplomatic buildings for all of the countries that were, well, they still are, I suppose, in the British Commonwealth, were dominions and colonies way back when. So yeah, I mean, there is some efforts to do that. I mean, the other thing is, I spoke about the RHA, the Royal Historical Society, that is a report in 2018 on race, ethnicity, and equality. A large part of that report highlighted the need for an intervention earlier on in the educational careers of students. And last year they released a roadmap for change, they called it, which set out their next steps, which they're taking. Well, again, I suppose I think they're taking this year, but they would have been taking this year. But I'm not sure exactly how far that project's got this year. But these next steps outlined were targeted specifically at secondary and primary education in terms of, doing the diversity, but also doing the decolonising of the curriculum as well. I mean, I think there are definitely things that we can do. I mean, I think again, and I think this sort of stood out again, that like in the protests over the summer, where were the senior Black historians other than David Olusoga, who were able to sort of, I think there was a lot of anger, some of it sometimes a bit incoherent. Where were the people who would explain exactly what people should be angry about in a specific sense, and this is the history, these are the things, and it's sort of, I sort of feel like it's been mainly him doing the public explaining. And I just wonder where else those academics are. But I suppose in an ideal world, that would be the role of the historian, in sort of like, it sounds very sort of lofty. I don't mean talking down to the to the public, but sort of, as like public intellectuals, I suppose, is how we can be useful, or at least academics, I think, can be useful.
Indeed. Thank you. Sarah, any last word on that?
So just, I suppose I'm surprised you didn't mention one of the things that we are really going to be working on strongly in the next few years, and it plays to this idea of the role of universities. So I think there's a huge number of different roles we play. One of the ones we play is producing really, high quality, highly engaged, highly educated citizens of the future. And Funmi is leading a really remarkable piece of work on cultural competency in terms of how every student and member of staff develops that as part of their education at King's. And I think that's one of the ways that we can address this widest, one person having a conversation has so much impact. Our 30,000 strong student body being able to critically engage with these ideas and think about how it affects them around the globe, and becoming ambassadors in terms of that, and being culturally competent in doing that will make an enormous change. And I think, Liam's laid out a lot of stuff we do. I suppose my perspective on, I think we do a number of things at King's, but I don't know necessarily that we are very well coordinated. And I think that maybe one of the things we can really think about doing in the future, we have a strong widening participation programme, and we have a number of things that we do. I think there's something about us being more organised with that, to be clear how much we are putting into it, maybe how we target it to get to the people that will benefit from it most, or whether we do some resources so that schools can call on those packs. We've worked with partners on that in gender. So there is, I think, something we could do in the race field too.
Yes, no, absolutely. I was kind of hoping we might have time to talk about the cultural competency program, because I think it's one of the most exciting things that I've seen in a while. And this was long in the making before COVID and George Floyd, but we've had to even fast track it more, because the idea, and very simply, it's the ability for one person to be able to see the world through the eyes of the other, and that other in their diversity. It's race, it's ethnicity, it's everything. I'm very quickly, the simplest way in which I've managed to explain to colleagues over time, when I felt hard done by on the basis of my gender, this was like 10, 15 years ago, one of my colleagues was saying, and then he came to me and said, I think I've just been dealt a blow. This is such a racist comment. I'm a Black man and we had conversations about gender before. He says, this feels so bad. I said, yes, that's how it feels when I'm treated, less favorably because I'm a woman. There is something about being able to see the world through the eyes of others. And our students are the first point of entry. From 2021, we'll offer cultural competency. I think I want to be able to say that this intersectionality offers a way out. The potential to ghettoize race is so huge. If we just pay lip service to it, or just try to paper over and the history doesn't matter, and so on. There's a lot to be done. I agree with you, Sarah. We need to coordinate more. There's a lot happening at King's now. There's even still much more to be done. What I'd like to do, because time has really, really gone, maybe what we can do is take some of the questions, the remaining questions, and publish that on social media, because we will not be able to do justice to the excellent questions that have come in. I want to read one in particular so that people understand where some of our colleagues are coming from. This is this is anonymous, and in a sense, we've kind of paraphrased it too. I'm a King's alumnus from the US who has witnessed firsthand the repercussions of the George Floyd protests. I see questions like, should I feel guilty? And color doesn't matter, very frequently. I'm curious, why do you think some people respond to conversations about structural racism with wanting to shut the conversation down completely, despite empirical evidence? And we will not be able to get into, and I think this question itself requires a lot of thoughtful, responses. and reflexivity, which is actually at the heart of the question of race and inequality. And I want to thank you for that, whoever sent that, because there's a dialogue to be had within our own university community, but outside with society as a whole. I'm sorry that time has just passed really quickly. I really appreciate that we had this evening to have this. I think this is one of many conversations, and I'd like to invite Marika to close, to give us closing remarks. Liam and Sarah, we will have many more of this. I want to thank you very deeply. Thanks.
Thank you, Funmi.
Thank you.
Big thank you to you all, to our speakers and and Funmi as well for such an insightful conversation today. Thank you also to our audience for your participation and all your thoughtful questions. Before I close today, just a couple of quick reminders. President and Principal Professor Ed Byrne will be presenting the KCLA annual address on the 18th of November, so do be sure to tune in for that. Next up in the King's Expert series, we'll be discussing some important work around children and young people's mental health on November 23rd. Do keep an eye on our website and your inboxes for more details of our upcoming events and programming coming your way very soon. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.